It's your show. I'm following you. I'm just holding this dog, Brian Last.
You know, we had someone, at least one, it may have been two people that wrote in the last 24 hours because I think the clip just went up on YouTube. And they said, Jim Cornette always says this thing about, you know, I'm holding the dog or whatever the expression is. But when he talked about Johnny Valentine, he said, in this case, it may be true. Why did he say that?
Valentine was known to be different and to have a very brutal sense of humor, if nothing else, and would at least go to any lengths for a rib, as well as in some cases also for gratification of some manner or another, as we've heard stories of down through the years, although I was never one to witness that personally. Did I tell you what we found out about Johnny Valentine in Louisville?
I don't know. I'm afraid. What animals do you have in Louisville?
No, it actually, part of it took place in the shower. But Bobby Heenan used to tell a story, and I think it was in one of his books also, but he told it to me, and his first day in wrestling, which actually when Bruiser had called him to the office and changed his name and told him, you're going to manage the Assassins, who were at the time were Guy Mitchell and Joe Tommaso, not the main set of Assassins in Georgia. This was in Indianapolis. And they sent him to Louisville in 1965, one of the last shows that Bruiser ran here before the town went dark. And that was his first night in wrestling. Well, one of the Assassins, I think it was Tommaso, didn't show up. So they put Bobby under the hood and they wore a full body gimmick, and they were treating Louisville like a spot show anyway. It was like a 4-match card. And he had to wrestle that night, and he'd never even managed before, but he ended up, they just stood him on the corner and he interfered a couple of times. The other guy did the thing, blah, blah, blah. But he said that night in the locker room, Johnny Valentine and Wee Willie Davis get into a fucking fight, and Wee Willie Davis is using his nightstick on Johnny Valentine, and guys were reaching for their bags like they had a gun. And then on the way home, he saw a wreck on the bridge across the Ohio River, and just what a night he had, first night in the wrestling business, right? But then John Cosper and I did research on Louisville during those years for the books that John has done, and, you know, I was tagging along and got to use some of it for Tuesday night at the Gardens. But there was that night, apparently the same night, Johnny Valentine was actually arrested here in Louisville by the cops. I'm trying to think, was it disorderly conduct or public drunkenness or some amalgamation of both, after the matches at what was then called Convention Center before they called it Louisville Gardens. And apparently that's what precipitated the fight with Wee Willie Davis, which Bobby had no idea who anybody was at that point. It's his first night in, and it's in Louisville. He's never been here before, whatever. Wee Willie Davis was not only an ex-wrestler who was like 6'9" and 320 pounds or whatever. He was one of the guys that had the tug of war with Mighty Joe Young in the 1949 movie, along with Sam Miniker and Angel and blah, 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 a whole bunch of guys. Well, since he had retired, Wee Willie Davis in the late 50s and through the mid 60s was kind of like either the local promoter in Louisville for Barnett's Indianapolis office. And he tried a little bit of promoting himself, but that didn't work. But he was the local promoter for the Indianapolis office, and he also worked for the sheriff's department. And apparently, whatever Valentine did and got in a beef with some fan in the audience or whatever the fuck, they sent Wee Willie Davis in to get Johnny Valentine, because now it makes perfect sense. They didn't even let the cops in the locker room back in the old days, in the 70s, when I started at the Gardens, unless there was some official business, right? But you couldn't just wander around in there. So a lot of the cops, they'd never been down there, and they think instead of going and, you know, in this wrestler's locker room with 10 or 12 of these guys, we'll send in Wee Willie Davis, who knows the situation. And apparently he and Valentine got in such a fucking beef that goddamn Davis took his nightstick and started whacking the fuck out of Valentine. And they ended up arresting him, taking him to jail that night. So it was interesting in the locker room back in the old days, too. It's just that it actually was more interesting now that I come to think about it. Nobody got nightsticked on this one by a giant who once had a tug of war with a fucking mutant gorilla.
All right, well, let's get away
Have those English words ever been put in that order before?
I believe that's a popular wrestling company, Mutant Gorilla or something.